Hello and welcome. My name's Philip and today I'd like to tell you about an amazing creature from the medieval world. It has 4 legs like a dog but a fish's tail, both fur and scales, and teeth like axes. Packs of them build castles in the European wilderness, and their body parts can cure illnesses. What's more, they have very bizarre and unique tactics for escaping from being hunted. And the thing is, these creatures aren't mythological. They're not made up or just the result of one scribe's overactive imagination. They're real, and they're still around today. I am, of course, talking about the beaver. The Eurasian beaver has a bit of an odd reputation in medieval literature, and as a result, medieval people writing about beavers has become a bit of a joke nowadays. Look up any online listicle about wacky medieval beliefs, and you'll probably find the beaver in there somewhere. The fantastical descriptions of these animals are often pointed at as examples of how silly and backwards medieval people were, and I actually think that's a little bit unfair. So in this video, I'm going to try and explain some of the strangest medieval beliefs, and hopefully we'll be able to figure out why people were so interested in this odd little animal. So let's start with some of the easier ones. Teeth like axes. Well, that actually makes quite a lot of sense. Gerald of Wales, a chronicler writing in the 12th century, described them as follows. It is worthy of remark that the beaver has but 4 teeth, 2 above and 2 below, which, being broad and sharp, cut like a carpenter's axe, and as such he uses them. So they're not necessarily saying that the teeth are axe-shaped, just that they can cut down trees like an axe, which is true. It's not entirely clear what Gerald means when he says that the beaver uses them like an axe. Perhaps the beaver swings its head like someone would swing an axe, but it could also just mean that they are used for the same purpose as a woodcutter's axe, to chop down trees. As funny as the first image is, I'm inclined to believe that Gerald meant the second option. It's a little bit more realistic. Interestingly enough, most medieval illustrations of beavers depict them with long, straight teeth, so not axe-shaped at all, although it does kind of make them look like weird vampire dogs. Next up, another easy one, building castles. Now Gerald touches on this as well, explaining how the beavers work together to build their castles in the middle of rivers. And he actually seems really amazed at the level of teamwork required to construct something so complicated. Nowadays, we're just sort of told that beavers build dams, and we accept it as an interesting fact, file it away in the back of our brain. But let's actually break it down for a moment. First, they have to pick a good spot. If the water's too shallow, it won't provide enough protection. Too deep, and construction would be impossible. Next, they dig into the riverbanks to divert water away and reduce the current where they want to build. Next, they take branches and logs that they've cut and drive them into the riverbed to create an underwater base to build on. They then collect sticks, twigs, stones, plant matter and mud in order to construct an underwater superstructure. They move logs into place by pulling them down mudslides or floating them down the canals that they have built. Once the dam has become big enough to flood the river to a level that provides adequate protection, only then do they start building the lodges on top, the actual parts that they live in. Eurasian beaver dams can range from 1 metre to 100 metres. That's 330 feet. Now, the Mott and Bailey Castle, for which Normans were famous for building, was a wooden structure atop an artificial hill, surrounded by a palisade and a deep ditch. By those standards, I think it's fairly reasonable for medieval scholars to be amazed at what they were seeing these beavers construct. Castles indeed. Okay, so those were the easy ones. Let's get on to something a bit weirder. Were beavers fish? This often turns up in a list of weird, wacky medieval beliefs. The roots are actually based in medieval fast days. Fasting was commonplace during the Norman period, but it didn't mean abstaining from all food entirely. Fast days were fairly regular, including not just the 40 days of Lent, but most Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays as well. On these days, Christians were supposed to abstain from eating the produce of animals and birds, so meat, cheese, eggs, whatever. And so instead, they could only eat fruit, vegetables, grains, and fish. The common story is that people didn't like doing this and so declared anything fishy to be a fish and therefore could get away with eating beavers' tails. Ha-ha! The truth, however, as is often the case, is a little more complicated. You see, medieval scholars didn't classify animals in the same way that we do nowadays. It wasn't a case of mammals, fish, reptiles, and so on. No, they mostly classified animals based upon where they were found, so beasts of the land, beasts of the air, beasts of the water. And this is why medieval bestiaries place bats alongside birds, but then go to great lengths to explain just how unique they are because they're so different to birds, yet are still beasts of the air. Beavers then provide a unique challenge, being physically similar to beasts of the land and breathing air, yet living most of their lives in and around water and having that scaly fish-like tail. In cases like these, it generally fell to church scholars to just try and use their better judgment. In the 17th century, the first bishop of Quebec requested clarification as to whether his parishioners could eat beaver tails during Lent, as they were far more abundant than fish. He received explicit permission that they count as fish, or rather, beasts of the water. Even as far back as the 12th century, Gerald of Wales recounts that in Germany and the Arctic regions, where beavers abound, great and religious persons in times of fasting eat the tails of this fish-like animal. It's important to note, however, that in these areas beaver meat was already being consumed, it just continued to be eaten during fast days. But why this fixation on the tail? Well, it's because those medieval people were so strange and wacky. They thought that it was half mammal, half fish, didn't they? Again, probably not. If an animal was classified as a beast of the water, then the whole animal was a beast of the water, even if it was furry. Otters often got called beasts of the water, and they're furry all over. The fixation on tails may actually have roots in Jewish law and the principle of Marit Ayin. This principle, literally meaning appearance to the eye, states that if something looks as though it's breaking the rules, even when it isn't, then it is equally forbidden, because it may confuse people who see it into thinking that the rules are being broken. In terms of food, This meant that you couldn't eat something that looked like a forbidden food, even if it was actually allowed. You couldn't, for example, carve up a furry quadrupedal animal that looks like a beast of the land, even though a beaver is a beast of the water. The tail, however, is scaly and looks like another fish, and so can be eaten without confusing anyone. This principle actually got sort of dropped towards later centuries, the late medieval period and particularly the early Renaissance. Start to see people creating mock foods where they would try and make something that looked like a forbidden food explicitly, like an egg made out of almond paste or a fake bacon made out of salmon and roe. Okay, so let's now address the strangest medieval claim about beavers, that their body parts had healing properties. Well, this is actually true. A beaver has two small round extremities between the hind legs, which produce a musky, sweet-smelling liquid called castoreum. Now, they use this for scent marking, as well as to waterproof their fur. Medieval beekeepers used to use it because they believed the sweet smell would encourage honey production, and nowadays it is still used in some perfumes. Most importantly, castoreum contains salicylic acid and other chemicals which provide a pain-relieving effect when ingested, similar to aspirin. Hildegard von Bingen, a 12th century abbess and scholar, wrote about the medicinal properties of castoreum, including a cure for fevers that was made by soaking the castor sacs in wine to create a medicinal liquor. The only thing is, she didn't call them castor sacs. In fact, none of the medieval scholars used the term castor sacs. You see, due to their size, shape, location, and the fact that castoreum is a milky white liquid, many medieval scholars quite reasonably assumed that the castor sacs were actually the beavers' the beavers' family jewels, despite the fact that male and female beavers both have castor sacs. Now, this confusion was only exacerbated by Isidore of Seville, who in his 7th century work Etymologies stated that the Latin name for beaver, castor, came from the word castrate. Now, this isn't true. Castor actually comes from the Greek name for a beaver, castor, whereas castrate comes from the Proto-Italic word for knife, castrum. The story, however, goes back even further to at least Aesop, who wrote in the 6th century BC that the beaver knows that he is hunted for his testicles, which are used to cure ailments. When pursued, the beaver runs for some distance, but when he sees he cannot escape, he will bite off his own testicles and throw them to the hunter, and thus escape death. Later writers added to this myth by saying that if you were to hunt a beaver that had already castrated itself, it would stand up on its hind legs to show you that the object of the hunt was already gone. Now, that is a really weird image, and there's not really much I can do to salvage it. Did Aesop just make up this story? I mean, there's no real way to tell, but it is worth noting many medieval scribes were copying from each other. I doubt very many of them had actually gone out beaver hunting themselves, and so stories tended to get repeated and recycled. The thing is, medieval bestiary writers loved this story about the beaver because it was a really good Christian allegory. You see, medieval bestiaries weren't just big catalogues of animals. but they were attempts to draw moral lessons from the natural world. And this story about a beaver is a great example of that. See, the Aberdeen Bestiary explains the beaver's self-castration by saying that, "Thus every man who heeds God's commandment and wishes to live chastely should cut off all his vices and shameless acts and cast them from him in the face of the devil. Then the devil, seeing that the man has nothing belonging to him, retires in disorder." And so this bizarre myth continued to be repeated, mostly because writers thought it was a good story. I mentioned hunting earlier. Beavers were hunted throughout Europe for centuries, not just for the castoreum and meat, but also for their fur. As mentioned, beaver fur is water resistant, and so is in high demand. In fact, the fur trade is the main reason for Eurasian beavers' population decline following the medieval period. Thankfully, there have been modern efforts to reintroduce the beaver to parts of Europe, including England and Wales, have seen some success. The population is on the rise again. I actually once had the opportunity to handle some ethically sourced beaver fur. It used to be a staple of the hat-making industry, and feeling it in your hands, you really get a sense of how water resistant it would be. I can imagine that for many Normans, handling beaver fur is probably the closest they would ever get to a cagoule. Who knows, maybe those of us in Europe will start to see the beaver become commonplace again. But whatever happens, it remains a fascinating discussion how this odd little creature captured the medieval imagination. Until next time, thanks for watching. Farewell. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed our beaver video. Are there any other weird medieval animals that you've heard of that you'd like to see us cover? I love reading bestiaries, there's so much interesting stuff to find. And we're going to definitely be doing more animal videos in future. But let us know in the comments below what you'd like to see and what your favourite animal is. And is it the bonnekin? If you don't know what the bonnekin is, maybe we'll have to talk about that in future. Until then though, take care, farewell.